For more on France's economy, I spoke with Jacob Kirkegaard. He's a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics here in Washington. I began by asking him to outline the current state of the French economy.
The French economy is not a disaster area, but it's clearly stagnating. And it doesn't have the ability to create jobs to the extent that it needs to. And that's why unemployment, and particularly, as you say, youth unemployment, but also long-term unemployment in France has remained very, very high, even as it has started to come down in the sort of crisis countries of Spain and Portugal and even Greece. So no, France has a structural growth problem, and only very serious structural economic reforms, which unfortunately the current president, François Hollande, has been quite reluctant to implement, have a chance of really shaking up that economy.
Now, talk about his efforts on labor law reform. I mean, they've been met with incredible resistance. We've seen so many strikes this year.
What it indicates is that François Hollande, as a socialist president, is nonetheless taking steps in the right direction. But I feel completely confident in saying that we are looking at something that is too little too late. Because it is true that he is doing something, and clearly some workers are up in arms about it, particularly that it has now become slightly easier to hire and fire workers in France, but only slightly. And the really big issues, such as, say, a 35-hour work week and other major distortions in the French labor market, the current government is not addressing. And therefore, unfortunately, in my opinion, François Hollande does not have much of an opportunity to really reverse this stagnation in the French economy.
How much of that is his leadership versus the parliamentary leadership and just the overall social expectations? I mean, you mentioned the 35-hour work week. That's very controversial to extend that.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's not only his problem, but he is the head of the Socialist Party, and the Socialist Party does have a majority in the French parliament. And on many of these issues, in fact, large parts of the French center-right should be in support of many of the sort of more liberalizing type of reforms, particularly in the labor market. So his inability to basically unify his own center-left party behind a pro-reform agenda is, in my opinion, really one of the most glaring deficiencies of his leadership of France.
So in comes Mr. Sarkozy, trying once again to be a savior for the French people. In 2012, he claimed to have saved France from a catastrophe in the financial crisis there. How does he campaign economically to reverse some of these wrongs that people may perceive were done under the Hollande administration?
He's campaigning against the presidency, who has an approval rating of 10 or 12%. So simply by campaigning of not being François Hollande is going to go quite far from him, in my opinion. But the reality is that in economic terms, at least, it is true that Nicolas Sarkozy guided France through the global financial crisis, etc. But he did that not by showing leadership, but rather by basically doing whatever Angela Merkel did and agreeing to that in Germany. So that's not really a platform to show leadership from, in my opinion. And the reality is also that as a domestic economic reformer, Mr. Sarkozy's own personal record in office was almost as poor as François Hollande. So I would be, quite frankly, skeptical that that Nicolas Sarkozy has much of a platform of earlier experiences and earlier achievements in office to really appeal much to the French electorate.
For the French, there's also the issue of Brexit. How do you see that playing, if at all, into the election and how the French feel about their economic prosperity?
I think the most immediate impact of the French election on Brexit and vice versa is that it will ensure that the French government and therefore the EU negotiating position with the UK over Brexit, over things like free movement of workers, particularly the rules and regulations guiding the European financial services sector and, of course, the City of London will be very tough. The French government is not going to be in the mood to offer any concessions or any sort of free lunches to the UK. So these negotiations between the EU and the UK over Brexit will be very contentious indeed. And this will, to a certain extent, be because of the political pressure coming from the French elections, but also later next year, elections in Germany. So it's a complicating factor.